And here we can see how economic map is structured. So what do we see here? On the horizontal line, which is the first yellow line, we see 5 programs, A, B, C, D, and E. Okay, these are the 5 programs. This is for a budget of this organization, I think for 2009, something like that, or maybe 10, I don't remember. These are the 5 programs that the organization operated at the time. Okay, and then we see 2 more columns. One is labeled infrastructure, and the second is labeled overhead. So what do we mean by that? That, again, to return to the general concept that I introduced in the previous class, now they are translated to real budget. So in the economic map or in the direct costing, we have the variable expenses for the programs, okay? And we have the fixed. So from the point of view of direct costing, there is no need to differentiate or create the distinction in the fixed cost between infrastructure and overhead. However, in the non-profit world, that is, again, something that I've introduced in the previous class, we look at the cost of the organization based on different definition, which is program cost and overhead. The reason for that is that many donors look at overhead meaning expenses for general and management and fundraising, as the part which is, you can say, a necessary evil. Okay, that's the general conception of overhead, a necessary evil. And they want to minimize the overhead. There are certain restrictions about overhead. So for our purposes—
What are these certain restrictions?
Well, in Israel, for example, if your organization let's say, has income which is below 10 million shekels, you cannot exceed 22% overhead expenses as part of the income. So if your income is exactly 10 million shekels, you cannot exceed 2.2 million shekels in overhead. That's a restriction which is forced by the government in Israel.
This is to ensure, because I had this discussion previously, not with you. 22% for the whole overhead or for the salaries?
For the whole overhead, for everything.
For everything?
Yes.
But is there a percentage for salaries?
No.
So I can use 20% for salaries and 2% for—
Yes, or 22% for salaries and 0 for the rest if you can. If you have the possibility, usually you can, because you have other things that you have to— You want to ask, Nizam? The same thing. Now, in the United States, for example, in which there is no regulatory restriction, there is kind of conceptual restriction. For example, it was a long time ago, but there was a survey that was done in the United States, and 700 foundations were surveyed, and they were asked, what, to your opinion, is a reasonable overhead rate? Now, their answer, the average, was 13%. Okay, so which is even lower than the Israeli restriction, about almost half. So there is a general notion, which again is probably incorrect. We'll discuss about it later on. We'll talk about overhead, but there is kind of a pressure on nonprofits to limit overhead expenses. Now, when we come to present the budget, since we will have to, when we'll go to full costing, we will have to load or apportion these parts on the programs. We would like to create a distinction between infrastructure, which is program cost, and overhead, on which we will have arguments with our donors. These are the instructions of a certain foundation in the United States, and you can see here program expenses, okay, which is divided to program direct. In our economic map, these will be the expenses or the cost that will be allocated to the program. Program administrative or indirect, these will be the expenses that in our economic map will be under infrastructure, and overhead, which will be in the column of overhead. Now, when we create an economic map in this way, it is easier in the second stage to move from the economic map to the full costing. Okay? So let me repeat, it is not, from the point of view of direct costing, it is not necessary to create this differentiation, but when we apply these methods to the NGO world, and we know that we will have to move from the economic map to full costing, it is more convenient to create this distinction in the fixed cost. These two columns are fixed from the point of view of the economic map. Okay? So let's go back to our Excel. All right, so infrastructure and overhead, both of them are fixed. And this is if you look at a budgetary structure and you ask yourself, is that a full costing or direct or economic map? The difference is the existence of these two columns. In full costing, these columns will disappear. All right? Okay, so this is one thing that we see here. Now, the total, right, for your question, this is what is presented usually in the annual reports. That is the total, which is total income broken down to sources, if you want to present it, and total expenses broken down to major cost items. So the vertical column shows us the first block, income. Now, income is broken down here. Obviously, these are aggregated figures. When you look at the more detailed budget of the organization, you will see more lines, but here we see only aggregated lines. So this is broken down by the four main components of income in a nonprofit, and that is government, donations, fees for services, and others. And don't ask me what is, usually people ask what is others or miscellaneous. There are others, all kind of income that cannot be defined by the other three. Like, for example, in Israel in 2020, many organizations received Corona grants from the government, okay? Which, not from the government, from the tax authorities or from social security, all kind of, right. So these are all kind of others. But the other three are important. We have government, which is a major funder of NGOs. We have donations, obviously, and fees for services are fees or charges that the organization, when the organization actually sells its services, receives from recipients. Yes, Tom.
But there's like a point at which the nonprofit has to not generate too much income for its services, right? Like it can't be, otherwise it becomes not a nonprofit.
Right. Well, you are right. It depends. In different countries, there are different taxation rules. In Israel, it's mainly concerned, you see, there are two ways to look at a nonprofit. When we talk about nonprofit, we have to understand that the restriction is not, it's not that you are not allowed to make a profit. You're not allowed to distribute the profits. Okay?
Amongst the board.
Amongst anybody.
Amongst the owners.
Right. There are no owners in the nonprofits, and there is no, nonprofits are prohibited from distributing profits, unlike commercial companies that distribute their profit.
So they can't, so basically. So
you're allowed to make a profit, but it has to be reinvested in the organization. Exactly.
Is there a limit?
Okay, so limits, it's a matter of, in every country, there are different restrictions. Yes, there is also an issue of accumulated profit, which we'll talk later on when we discuss financial statement, and then I will talk about restrictions there, because there are certain restrictions. But it is permitted to nonprofits to make a profit as long as it is invested in the organization and not distributed under certain restrictions that we will talk later on. Okay? All right, now let's go back to our economic map. So we have here the main components of our cost structure. You can see salary, service suppliers, maintenance, all kind of cost items. And these are allocated to the different programs. So let's go program by program and see what we have here. Let's start with income. So unlike the usual presentation here, the totals are presented on top. So total income is the light blue line, total expenses is the orange, and the green line is the contribution, which we'll discuss in a minute. So first we start with income. So you can see that there are 5 programs. If you look at the funding, you can see that the 2 rehabilitation programs are funded by the government. The government does not fund other programs as a matter of policy. In the donation part, we can see a donation for program C, which is a designated donation, and another amount in infrastructure. So that deserves an explanation. So when we look at our income, we already know that we have earmarked and are earmarked or designated or undesignated. So the designated donations will be presented for the specific program that they are designated to. So here we have designated donation or donations. This is aggregated figure for program C. What do we do with the undesignated donations? So basically, since these donations are for the capacity building of the organization, we record them in the part of the fixed cost. They are meant to cover the fixed cost of the organization. Now, we can put them either in the column of infrastructure or in the column of overhead. It doesn't matter. Both methods are acceptable. So I put them under infrastructure, but you can also put the undesignated or unearmarked donation here in overhead. Because these are the sources to cover the cost items that donors do not, buyers do not want to cover. Okay? Then we have fees for services. Fees for services are usually for programs, fees that are generated due to the programs. Although sometimes we may see, like alumni or kind of membership programs that fees for services will appear in the infrastructure or overhead. Okay, and other is not important, so I'm not going to discuss others. All right, so this is what we see in the income, and then we see the total income. Yes.
I didn't really get what fees of services mean. So this, like the beneficiary statement.
Okay, so fees, let me give you specific examples for this organization. So you can see in program A for adults, a significant amount for fees for services. So these are the fees for services here, which means people who pay for the treatment. Okay. We also see small amounts in the youth, some kind of participation. Here in the outreach, the organization provides lectures, activities in the communities, and they ask for payment for that. Payment can be partial, but still payment from participants. So everything, fees for services is every income which is generated from the participants in the program. Okay? You should understand fees for service, you pay a significant amount as a fee for service, right? Hopefully you get the service, but you certainly pay.
But it's still
okay, I'm just joking. Yes,
but it's still non-profit. Even though a lot of people pay for the services that they get.
Again, the definition of non-profit is, first of all, the fact that somebody pays does not mean that the organization makes a profit. You know, payment can be partial. But even if the organization makes a profit, the definition of non-profit is the restriction of not distributing the profit and not having a profit. Okay, so you can have very, very wealthy non-profits. I mean, in the United States, the private universities have accumulated profits of billions of dollars, but they're still considered non-profits. Okay. All right. Expenses. So let's look at salaries. So salaries are allocated, as you can see, to the different programs. And we have another salary item for the overhead. So this is very simple. Salaries of people who are employed in the different programs and their position will be terminated if the program will be closed. This will be recorded here. While here there is no salary in the infrastructure, but there is salary in the overhead, which we understand. This will be the CEO, the CFO, accounting staff, legal staff, and things like that, administrative staff. Okay? And again, we go for the rest of the item. Note, we will go back to that there are two items that appear here in the infrastructure. That is rent. That is rent, okay? And maintenance and what is this? Communication, okay? So these are the rent. This organization rents a large facility for its programs. And this facility, there is a rent payment which is completely independent of the actual programs, which means even if the organization will close the entire programs, they will have to pay the rent as long as they occupy the premises. Okay? So these are examples of items, cost items that fall under fixed cost in the infrastructure. Also, there are items that fall under fixed cost in the overhead part. And you have to remember that it's not an exact science. The 80-20 rule here applies, which means that even if you are writing 80%, that's okay. But the way to do that in real life is to ask yourself, what will happen to this cost item if I will close this program? Will it disappear? Will it diminish by 50% or whatever? The part that we change, that the variable part, that is the part that should be allocated to that specific program. Okay, so again, here in class, you have no problem. I will tell you in advance, so you don't have to be concerned about that. In real life, it is sometimes, it's not a big challenge, but it requires some thinking about what will happen if the program is discontinued. Okay, now we have total expenses for each program. And again, remember, this is not the full cost of the program because there is two significant amounts that were not allocated to the programs, which are part of the fixed cost. And then we have the light green line at the bottom, which is under the title economic contribution. Okay, so if you recall, I told you that the direct costing is also called contribution accounting or contribution costing. And the term contribution comes here. Now I call it economic contribution. The reason is not English, is Hebrew, because in Hebrew, the word truma can be translated as either contribution or donation, which two completely different meaning in English. So I use truma kalkalit or economic contribution in Hebrew, and I translated also to English. But in English, it can be only contribution. What is this line? It is the difference between the income, earmarked income, the designated income to this program, minus the expenses that were allocated based on the direct costing method. What does it mean? So it means that if the criteria to include income in the income part is only the income that is either directly generated or designated to this program, it means that if this program, let's say program A, will be discontinued, this income of 4,064,000 will disappear. We will not receive it. So we will lose this income. Now, since the criteria for including cost by the direct costing method is only the cost that will be saved if the program is discontinued, then if we close the program, we will lose an income of 4,064,000. We will save expenses of 3.1. Okay? So the difference, the contribution, if we close this program, since the contribution is positive, this is a contributing program, or I will use another term, subsidizing program. So if I close it, I will lose this amount. I will lose income, which is higher than the expenses that I will save. Again, if I close this program, I will lose income of 4 million and something. I will save expenses only of 3.1. So I will lose this amount. So when the economic contribution is positive, that means that this program is subsidizing. It has positive contribution for covering the fixed cost of the organization. Okay? And if this is the case, then closing this program will be harmful to the organization from the economic point of view. Now, if we go, let's say, to program E, in program E, we see the opposite situation. The designated income is 421,000, almost 422, while the expenses are 727,000. So if I will close this program, then I will lose income of 422,000, but I will save expenses of 727. So the net effect will be that my economic situation will improve by exactly this amount, 305,000. So negative economic contribution means that this program is subsidized. It is subsidized by the other programs. And that means that when the program is subsidized, closing it will be beneficial from the economic point of view only. Remember, this is an NGO, has social goals, but from the economic perspective only. As you can see, the economic contribution is an extremely important piece of information that we need in our organization. So let's go over the major points that we can see in an economic map. So the first is the economic contribution and its meaning, and this is extremely important for, as I said, on go, no-go decisions and for prioritization. So we have programs with positive economic contribution. We have programs with negative economic contribution. When we have a situation in which we have to take a no-go decision, meaning we have to close one of the programs. We have a reduction in income. We cannot raise enough income to cover all our expenses, and we start considering what to do. One of the options is closing. So obviously, we want to close the programs with the negative economic contribution, those that are subsidized, because if we close a program with a positive economic contribution, we will do double damage. We will damage our economic situation, and we also damage our social goals. Okay? So this is a very important aspect. But also, closing decisions are, you don't take closing decisions every year. Usually once every 7 years, I know, when there is a crisis. But also for prioritization, because when you look at this economic map, let's see it again. And we look at program E with a negative economic contribution. It is a subsidized program. It means that other programs have to subsidize it. So the question has to be asked, why do we want to subsidize this program? Why do we want to take kind of resources from other programs and invest in this program? So the only, I would say, rational reason for that is that this program is very important in the scale of our social goals. Again, remember that we are a social organization. Now, managing a social organization is more difficult than managing a commercial company, because in commercial company, you have one scale, that is profit. In the social organization, you have two scales. You have the economic scale here, but also you have your social scale, which may be a little bit difficult to determine, but still, you have to be convinced that this program is important enough for achieving the organizational goal in order to agree to subsidize it. But to take such decision, you need to see the economic map. Just to elaborate on this example, when I presented to the director of this organization the economic map of his organization, he was not aware that this program is subsidized. And when he became aware, he decided to reduce its expenses. Okay, he just decreased the program, made it smaller so that it will not have such a negative economic contribution. Okay, so in terms of prioritization, when you have programs with positive economic contribution, even if they are less important in your, let's say, social scale, you still want to keep them because they subsidize. And again, if we use the example of the community center, so community centers usually have programs which can fall under the definition of a country club, right? They have a pool, they have a gym, they have all that. These are programs that from the point of view of the directors are not very important for their social goals, but they subsidize the other programs which are more important for the social goals and may have negative economic contribution. Okay, so prioritization, and I would say any strategic planning in nonprofits misses a dimension if we don't see the economic map, if we don't make that meeting between the social goals and the social contribution of any program and the economic contribution. So that is the first point. Okay, second point is basically the same, subsidizing versus subsidized. Now, buy or build grants that we saw already, and I'm going to show you again. So the economic map shows us explicitly in the line of donations, which donations are buyers and which are from buyers and which donations are from builders. So we can see it explicitly. It is very clear. That is why we put these donations here in the infrastructure overhead. Okay? And the last point. Planned surplus. Okay, very important point. So let's go and see it first.
Can I ask one question first?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
So in theory, the people were supposed to make the decision about the economic contribution versus the social contribution, right? Like the kind of, where is it worth to make our investment should be the board in theory, right? Not necessarily the CEO. The CEO maybe manages that decision, but
right.
The board is actually charged with
right.
that decision.
Right.
But isn't there a tension with the board also being often donors?
Now, I can tell you from experience that since I've been working with American boards, I would say almost my entire professional career, that I didn't see any conflict of interest when the board was presented with this type of information. Since once you are on the board of an organization, you have, it's called in English, a fiduciary responsibility, which means that you have a legal responsibility for the well-being of the organization. And if the organization fails, people can actually sue you, even personally, for making the wrong decisions. And that, to my experience, kind of overrides your interest as a donor. But again, this is the reason I call it economic map is because this kind of budgetary structure shows you the strength and weaknesses from the economic point of view of the different programs and how they all contribute to the overall well-being of the organization, which we'll discuss in a minute. And this is essential for not only for managing, it's not something that is essential for daily management, it's essential for the big decision, the strategic decision. My opinion, you cannot take a strategic decision in an organization without having this information of the economic map. Now, if you sit on the board and you have other interests apart from the well-being of the organization, you have to put them aside. There's no other way. Now, look, conflict of interest exists also in board of directors of commercial companies. Because some people sit in the board of one commercial company, but they also have interest in another commercial company, and there may be conflict of interest. So if you sit in the board, you have to get past that and take decision which only looks at the well-being of this organization. And this is your legal obligation as a board member. Okay, what to do? All right, now, the last point here is that as we look, and this is a budget, and the planned income and the planned expenses, we can see an actual profit or actual surplus if we use the more clean terminology of non-profits. We can see that the planned income is higher than the planned expenses by 600,000. And question already was raised here. Can we do that? Are we allowed to do that? Okay. So I will argue here is that not only that we're allowed to do that, usually in most cases, we must do it. And I will explain. First of all, the case of this organization is completely different. This organization was in a very difficult economic situation, and it took loans to cover previous accumulated deficits. And this amount here was basically the amount that was put aside to cover the repayments of the loan. Okay? Now, loans are not expenses. They're not, from the accounting point of view, they're not expenses because it's just money that you receive at a certain period and you repay. By the end of the period, it becomes zero, right? You repay the entire loan. So it's not an expense. An expense never comes back, but the loan comes back. So, but if you have a loan and you need loan repayment, you have to, in your budget, to put aside a certain amount for that loan. How will that amount look like? It will look like exactly what we see here. Income higher than expenses, and the difference will go to cover the loan. So this is the case of accumulated deficit. But even if we don't have accumulated deficit, and this is again a topic that we will discuss extensively in the second part of the semester, that's the second paradox of nonprofits. Nonprofits are expected to spend their entire income. When you are a donor and you give money to a nonprofit, you expect the organization to spend the money on programs or on capacity building or something. They are not expected to create surpluses. But there is another expectation from nonprofits. They are expected to be financially stable. What does it mean financially stable? It means that when there is a reduction in income, whether temporary or permanent, the organization is expected to be able to sustain its activity until it reorganizes based on lower level of income, or if it is just a temporary reduction in income until income goes back to its previous level. How do you do that?
Forecasting?
Well, forecasting is just a method to try to look at the future, but what if you look personally at yourself, if you suddenly lose your job, you don't have any income, and you can get another job in 3 months, and let's say there is no unemployment benefits. How do you survive? Based on
What you have said is.
Cost and saving. Cost cutting what you can, but you have to eat, right? You have to pay the rent. You don't want to move to the street and eat from garbage cans. So you need to have savings. The more savings you have, the more protected you are from fluctuations in income. You can live off your savings until income goes back, until you find a new job. Okay? So organizations are exactly the same thing. In order to survive, in order to maintain or sustain their activities in difficult time, they need to have savings. How do you create savings? How do we create savings? We spend less than we make, right? We have less income than less expenses than our income. And the difference is savings, goes to our saving account. How do you create savings in a non-profit? You have to make profits. The only way to create savings in a non-profit, unlike commercial company that can raise funds from the public by adding more shareholders and getting equity, non-profits cannot get equity. They can only make accumulated profits or accumulated surplus. So on one hand, organizations are expected to be stable, meaning to have a certain level of savings. And we will discuss later on what is an acceptable level of savings and how do we know what is our savings. But we understand that we need to have savings. And on the other hand, we are expected to spend all our money. This is a contradiction in terms. It's not possible to spend all your money and to have savings. So nonprofits have to have profits for savings. And we will see later on how we can create these savings.